Thank you.
Maybe just to kick things off, I want to congratulate you on the successful Maestro-NASH study results with the impressive outcomes on both NASH resolution and fibrosis improvement. And maybe if you could please provide a brief overview of Madrigal as a company and your approach to NASH with resmetirom, and why has treating NASH remained such a large unmet medical need?
So you want to
you go ahead, Beck.
Okay. I mean, NASH has actually been around for, many years, and was first discovered as a liver disease that was associated with metabolic factors such as diabetes and obesity many years ago in patients who did not consume a large amount of alcohol. And that's where it got the name non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. In fact, on a liver biopsy, alcohol-related liver disease and NASH look essentially indistinguishable. So that disease has been around, but the prevalence has shot up dramatically in the last 10 or 20 years due to the epidemic of obesity and diabetes, which is really worldwide. And there is no approved therapy for NASH. And so resmetirom, which is a liver-directed therapy targeting specifically the liver and improving the health of the liver, as you mentioned, showed efficacy both in the inflammatory aspects of NASH, so NASH resolution, as well as in reducing the fibrosis in these advanced F2, F3 patients, which is very important in preventing the long-term consequences of NASH, which is cirrhosis, liver failure, and other types of decompensation, including a high rate of heart disease, which is where the atherogenic lipid lowering, LDL and other lipids by resmetirom is very important.
Excellent. That's super helpful. Thank you for that background. And then maybe just to get into some of the details of Maestro-NASH, can you remind us the Maestro-NASH study design and types of patients that you enrolled and any feedback that you've received from experts, especially on the convincing nature of these outcomes that you've reported?
Yeah, so we took a direction to try to enrich for NASH patients right from the beginning in terms of what we call our pre-screening criteria that were unique to the Maestro-NASH study, and they're going to be very important in terms of how we identify patients in the future when resmetirom is approved, is an approved therapy. And I would say of all the studies, Maestro-NASH had the lowest screen fail rate that I've heard of on the liver biopsy. So what we did was we enriched for patients who actually had NASH, not just fat in their liver, by requiring that the patients had at least 3 metabolic risk factors to begin with. So they had diabetes, obesity, and typically, or insulin resistance. So almost 100% of these patients are insulin resistant. About 80% hypertension, 70 or 80% had dyslipidemia, meaning low HDL cholesterol. So they had low levels of the good cholesterol and high triglycerides. About half of them were on statins, primarily the diabetic patients. So they were very enriched for having fatty liver and very enriched for having inflamed fatty liver. And then we had another test that it further enriched them called the FibroScan, where we selected for patients that had a liver stiffness of at least 8.5, meaning that they might have F2 level fibrosis or F3 level fibrosis. And we also added an additional confirmation, which was measuring liver fat on MRI-PDFF, which is 100% accurate for fatty liver disease. So with all of these tests, by the time we did the liver biopsy, we had 70 to 80% of these patients had significant at-risk NASH. And that's how we enrolled the study. So it does have a lot of relevance to how we can identify these patients in the future, even without a liver biopsy.
Great. That's super helpful. Thank you for that. And then I guess since you elected to pursue co-primary endpoints of both NASH resolution and fibrosis improvement, can you just talk about the rationale for that? And then also maybe a little bit on your definition of NASH resolution?
Yeah, so what we had in reality was something called a dual primary endpoint. A co-primary endpoint means that you have to achieve both endpoints. It was set up that we had an either-or situation. Now, in fact, we did achieve both endpoints, as it turned out, with very high statistical significance. And the reason for doing this is that there was really no downside to allowing a successful study if you achieved either endpoint. The FDA has recognized that both of these endpoints are reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, which is the basis for the accelerated approval in NASH. So we actually achieved both of these endpoints at both of the doses that we chose, both 80 milligrams once a day oral medication or 100 milligrams once a day medication. So our definition. So I would also remind you, this is a phase 3 study. So it's very different from how a phase 2 study is analyzed, where typically you only look at paired liver biopsies. Here, any patient who entered the study, whether or not they had a week 52 liver biopsy, so they had a baseline biopsy, and most of the patients also had a week 52 biopsy, but not all did. And just to remind you, the study was enrolled and conducted during the COVID pandemic, so we probably had a somewhat higher rate of non-completion than we would have had in the absence of the COVID pandemic. But still, it was a very, very well conducted study. And but we do an ITT analysis where we include all the patients who were in the study, whether or not they had this week 52 biopsy, and if they didn't have the biopsy, they're called a non-responder. So we had approximately 30% NASH resolution rate, given that caveat in the drug treatment arms, and about a 26% fibrosis reduction rate in the drug treatment arms. The NASH resolution rate was 8 or 9% in the placebo arm, and about 14% for fibrosis. The NASH resolution rate in the placebo arm was less than 10%, which is it's a relatively low placebo rate. And one of the things we did with our NASH resolution endpoint is requiring at least a 2-point reduction in the NAFLD activity score, the NAS, in addition to having a 0 on ballooning and a 0 or 1 on inflammation, with no worsening of fibrosis. So it was a very stringent endpoint. And we used that endpoint that was called by FDA reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, to get to reduce the noise in the study. If you have such a simple endpoint to achieve, for example, NASH resolution, which is a single point improvement in an endpoint like ballooning, then you can't really be confident that that's actually an improvement. It could just be sampling variability in the biopsy. So with that more stringent endpoint, we were able to get a more accurate measurement of the resolution of NASH, and it's very convincing for the drug effect.
Okay, great. Thank you for that explanation. That's helpful. And then I think one thing that investors are looking forward to, and I think we just got the date for this last Friday, is the FDA Advisory Committee meeting on obeticholic acids NDA for NASH. We didn't get one last time their NDA was reviewed, so I think this is a nice opportunity for investors to get a little view into how the FDA is thinking about NASH. What sort of lessons do you expect to learn from that AdCom for OCA and NASH? And is there any read across to resmetirom and NASH?
I think that it's an opportunity to hear the kind of questions that people will have about a drug being potentially approved for the treatment of NASH. And people have interpreted this different ways. It's a very late announcement of an AdCom. I mean, normally when the NDA is accepted, that's the time that the AdCom is announced, and that didn't happen here. So I'm not really sure what the meaning of that is. However, I think hearing any kind of perspective, whether it's from the committee itself, or from patient advocates, or for NASH treatments, I think it will be informative to resmetirom. It doesn't mean anything about our particular NDA submission. Has no direct impact on that.
Okay, understood. Thank you for that. And then as we look ahead to your NDA submission for resmetirom, could you maybe just update us on the current status of that filing? How's that progressing, and how confident are you that achieving those two dual primary endpoints would support approval of resmetirom under the subpart H pathway that you described earlier.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we've said all along that we have, received guidance from the agency, throughout the time period that we've been working in our phase 3. So we're very confident on how the structure of the NDA and what we need to include in the NDA. We took a very important step along the way by doing a complete additional study, Maestro-NAFL, which also included another safety population with 180 NASH cirrhosis patients that greatly expanded. So it's more than 1,300 patients plus an extension of that study. Plus this a large NASH cirrhosis cohort it gives us the type of safety database that's necessary to support accelerated approval at both doses 80 and 100. We also started a second outcome study, Maestro-NASH Outcomes, which is a study in NASH cirrhosis patients. So we have a robust, large program to help provide the type of evidence that's needed to demonstrate a good, approvable risk-benefit ratio for resmetirom. The drug has been very safe. There's no, incidence of serious AEs that is in excess of what's occurring in the placebo arm, and really the only AE has been in excess is mild GI AE at the beginning of therapy, and this was also demonstrated in Maestro-NASH. So I think, given that together, that's our goal, is to provide that evidence for a good risk-benefit ratio for both the 80 and 100 milligram doses of resmetirom.
So I'd just add that we've been guided to filing in the first half of the year, and our guidance hasn't changed.
Okay, great. That's perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that you mentioned Maestro-NAFLD1 and understand that supports the safety database for resmetirom. And some investors ask us occasionally, what is the role for the efficacy portion of that study, and how do you expect that to appear in the label for resmetirom?
So, the label discussion is very late in the process. And it is, it's a very interesting situation where the endpoints are on liver biopsy. So fibrosis reduction and NASH resolution on liver biopsy. That's what will be in the clinical trial section in the label. But the overall is the treatment of NASH, of patients with NASH and liver fibrosis. That's the indication. And how exactly the wording goes is obviously going to be an important discussion with the agency. What's interesting is that we don't expect to be doing diagnosis with liver biopsy. It's not used very commonly. There are other ways of diagnosing NASH at this point, and monitoring patients without serial liver biopsies.
Okay, makes perfect sense. Thank you for that. Can you talk about how the launch plans are progressing? What types of patients and physicians do you expect to be your initial targets for the launch of resmetirom in NASH, and what sort of investments that you're making now and planning to make for the infrastructure?
Sure, Jay. I think there's 3 questions there. If I don't address something, please, just remind me at the end and we can go into it. So, we have a realization, as anybody should, this is a nascent category. Although there's, sufficient number of patients already identified and being coded, we still have to develop it. So education of payers, U.S. payers, has been ongoing for about 2 years now. That involves one-on-one discussions, walking them through what NASH is, what the unmet need is, how the use of non-invasives in NASH, and those have been going well. They'll transition into cost effectiveness, budget impact modeling discussions later this year as we come closer to PDUFA. With physicians, we're focused on HEPs, GIs, and endocrinologists, a subset of them. We've signaled there's about 15,000 to 20,000 physicians, specialists in the U.S. that are going to be responsible for vast majority of treatment with NASH that are FDA-approved drugs, treatment of NASH with FDA-approved drugs. So we've been educating them in a really targeted fashion. 2 things to highlight: in the NASH conferences and GI conferences and hepatology conferences, we've been out there with our company-sponsored education program around NASH. We've also launched about a year ago our digital campaign that you can look up right now, nashexplored.com, that, gives the views about the unmet needs and also, how to identify patients in real life setting and the like. So we're doing all of those things. Patient education, we've been primarily focused on it in partnership with the Global Liver Institute and Fatty Liver Foundation, the two premier patient advocacy organizations. Next quarter, we also add in our patient digital disease education campaign. And again, we're going to be very targeted, targeting to patients that have been identified as fatty liver disease or NAFLD patients and NASH patients. So all of that's going to help us develop the market. As far as where we are, we know what our strategy is going to be, our go-to-market strategy, as far as who to focus on for launch, as far as physicians, what kind of sales force we need, how to, distribute them across the U.S. All those decisions are made, positioning of the brand. I think what we have to do next is, for example, our full market access team, a small part has been with us, but account management team and the like come in April. Salesforce, our head of Salesforce is here. The build starts as far as, the zone directors coming in July, and then we expect to have the Salesforce fully recruited, onboarded in Q4 based on how the PDUFA timelines are. So, as far as investment, Paul has mentioned this is, looking like a specialty launch. So calling on around 15 to 20,000 physicians at launch, a sales force of about 200 people in the field, maybe supported by another 50, 75 at headquarters or market access, patient access. That's how we're thinking about the investment in this launch.
That's very comprehensive. And then just to follow up on about payers, can you just talk about, for the purpose of reimbursement, how do you plan to keep value proposition from, and any comments that you could share with us regarding the recent ICER report?
Yeah, absolutely, Jake. Two great questions. As far as, U.S. payers, besides the education part of it, we also talk to them via market research, comprehensive market research, to understand what they're really thinking when they're not talking to us face to face. What they find very attractive in resmetirom is that the drug hit both surrogate endpoints. The drug is oral, the drug is safe from what the data shows. So they're attracted to this product profile. They see the unmet need of what we call treating at-risk NASH without cirrhosis. So F2, F3 on biopsy, although nobody's going to do biopsy, and nobody does biopsy in clinical setting right now outside of clinical trials. So from their perspective, the drug is attractive. It answers an unmet need. Regarding ICER, we were not surprised by the highly favorable review of resmetirom. Resmetirom, when you look at the profile, is that cost effective? ICER said in the review that resmetirom is cost saving for the U.S. system at a price of $19,900 or so. And if you want to look at 100,000 quality gained measure, which is what a lot of pharma companies do when they think about pricing, the pricing could be $37K or so. So we're not going to make any sort of judgments right now. Becky's work with the FDA to define a proper label is instrumental. So once we have label in hand, I think the point to say is ICER has further solidified what we expected as a good level of flexibility to price the drug appropriately while keeping patient affordability in mind.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And then maybe shifting gears to Maestro outcomes for a moment. Can you talk about the potential to treat NASH patients with compensated cirrhosis with resmetirom? I know this has been a difficult patient population to treat based on other studies. What's the unmet need here, and what are your thoughts?
So, there's a ton of these patients with NASH cirrhosis and increasing. The population we're treating is well-compensated NASH cirrhosis. So they enter this period, and really it's between an F3 stage and an F4 stage where they have more fibrosis in their liver, but they are what's called mildly hepatically impaired. And over the next couple of years, depending on exactly where they are on that timeline, patients can decompensate, meaning that they can develop portal hypertension, which is associated with ascites and varices or dilated blood vessels that can bleed, or hepatic encephalopathy are common things that happen to these patients when they decompensate. And when they decompensate, it's really a desperate situation, and they have a very high mortality in the absence of liver transplant, et cetera. So this is a very sick population, high medical costs, et cetera. So what we've shown is that resmetirom works well and safe in well-compensated NASH cirrhotics that we've studied. And there are some important findings in terms of the activity of resmetirom in a large cohort of these patients that had resmetirom was active, it reduced potentially signs of liver decompensation in these patients, reducing their enlarged liver size and their enlarged spleen size, and having some other potentially antifibrotic actions in the NASH cirrhotic population. So those were all exploratory studies we did as in a large cohort. Now we're treated more than a couple hundred NASH cirrhotics. So the idea is now is this placebo-controlled outcome study. It's completely clinical. There's no liver biopsies in the study, and we're just following well-compensated NASH cirrhosis patients in a double-blind placebo-controlled study of about 700 patients out for a couple years to collect outcome events or decompensation events. So that's the study. And it will be, if resmetirom is successful in that study, it will support full approval for non-cirrhotic NASH and also a new indication for the treatment of cirrhotic NASH.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we'll look forward to those study results. And then maybe just going back to Maestro NASH for a moment, since you did hit both of the dual primary endpoints, would that support EMA approval? And will you, if so, do you expect to seek a partner in Europe to help you launch resmetirom for NASH in Europe, or is that something that Madrigal would do independently?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two questions there. So on the regulatory side, we believe that the package will also support accelerated approval with EMA, and we're working on that submission that we expect to be within a few months after the submission of the NDA to FDA. And then as far as the commercialization in Europe, we have made comments on that, and I'll hand that off to Paul or Remy on that.
Yeah, so we've said that we are not planning to become a global pharmaceutical company, and that we are seeking a partner for ex-US marketing.
Okay, great. Any guidance on the timeline for that?
I think it happens when it happens. You can't really. I think you don't want to say anything on the timelines. Obviously, we'd have to have a partner in place before a launch in the EU, but we would look to have something, a deal done well before that. I just don't want to give you a month and a day when we'd have it done.
Okay, fair enough. Understood. I think that brings us to the end of our time, so we'll wrap things up there. Thank you all so much. It's been a great pleasure catching up with all of you. Congrats on the progress, and we'll look forward to future updates with an exciting year ahead.
All right. Thanks very much for having us, Jay. Appreciate it.